The summer sun bore down mercilessly on the Oklahoma plains, turning the air thick and shimmering above the parched earth. Thomas Brennan straightened his back, feeling every one of his 32 years in the ache that ran from his shoulders to his hips. His small farm stretched before him, rows of struggling corn fighting against the drought that had plagued the territory for weeks. Sweat soaked through his cotton work shirt, and dust clung to every inch of exposed skin, mixing with the salt of his perspiration to create a gritty film that made him feel like he was slowly becoming part of the land itself. He had been working since first light, as he did every day, tending to crops that seemed determined to wither despite his best efforts. The land here was unforgiving, a test of will as much as skill. Thomas had claimed this plot 3 years ago, building his cabin with his own hands, clearing the field stone by stone. Each rock removed had been a small victory, each post driven into the hard ground a testament to his determination. Solitude had become his companion, the endless prairie his only view. Most days, he heard nothing but wind and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead, searching for prey in the vast expanse of grass and sky. The isolation wore on him sometimes. There were moments, usually in the depths of night when sleep eluded him and the cabin felt oppressively small, when he questioned why he had chosen this life. He could have stayed back east, found work in a city, married perhaps, raised a family in the comfort and safety of civilization. But something in him had always craved the openness of the frontier, the challenge of carving a life from raw land. His father had been a farmer, and his grandfather before that. The work was in his blood, even if the loneliness sometimes felt like too high a price to pay for independence and open skies. Thomas paused near the well, drawing up a bucket of cool water. The rope was rough against his calloused palms, familiar and worn from daily use. He drank deeply, letting the water run down his chin and neck, offering brief relief from the oppressive heat. The moisture evaporated almost immediately in the dry air, leaving behind only a slightly cooler sensation that faded within moments. The sky above was a pale, washed-out blue, cloudless and offering no promise of rain. He had been watching the horizon for weeks now, hoping for the dark clouds that might bring relief to his struggling crops, but day after day brought only relentless sunshine and heat that seemed to suck the life from everything it touched. He scanned the horizon out of habit, looking for any change in the weather, any sign that the drought might break. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of brown and gold grass that rippled in waves when the wind blew. In the distance, he could see the dark shapes of buffalo moving slowly across the plains, and beyond them, nothing but more grass and sky meeting at an indistinct line that seemed impossibly far away. That's when he saw her. At first, he thought the heat was playing tricks on his eyes. The air shimmered and danced above the ground, creating mirages and distortions that could make a man see things that weren't there. A small figure wavered in the distance, stumbling through the tall grass at the edge of his property. Thomas shielded his eyes with his hand, squinting against the glare. The figure moved erratically, swaying as if about to fall, then catching itself and lurching forward a few more steps before swaying again. Without thinking, operating on pure instinct, he grabbed the water bucket and began running toward the edge of his field. His boots pounded against the hard earth, sending up small clouds of dust with each step. His heart hammered in his chest, driven by concern and a growing sense of urgency. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and every second might matter. As he drew closer, his chest tightened with concern. It was a child, a young girl, barely 10 years old by his estimation. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands around her face, matted with sweat and dust. Her buckskin dress was torn and filthy, hanging loosely on her small frame. She was Comanche, he realized immediately, recognizing the style of her clothing and the deep bronze of her skin. Her small feet were bare and bleeding, cut and scraped from walking across rough terrain. Her lips were cracked and split from dehydration, her face gaunt and hollow-cheeked. She looked like she had been wandering for days without food or water, pushed to the very limits of what her small body could endure. She saw him approaching and tried to back away, fear flashing in her dark eyes. But her legs buckled beneath her, no longer able to support even her slight weight, and she collapsed to her knees in the dry grass. A small cloud of dust rose around her as she fell. Thomas slowed his pace immediately, not wanting to frighten her further. He held his hands up to show he meant no harm, his palms open and visible. He knelt several feet away from her, setting the bucket down and pushing it gently toward her with one hand. "Water," he said softly, keeping his voice calm and even, as if speaking to a frightened animal. "You need to drink. Please." The girl stared at him, her chest heaving with panicked breaths. Her eyes were wide and filled with terror, darting from his face to the bucket and back again, calculating, trying to determine if this was a trap, if accepting help from this white stranger would lead to capture or worse. Thomas remained perfectly still, barely breathing, letting her make the decision. He could see the internal struggle playing out across her young face, thirst warring with fear and distrust. Her whole body trembled, whether from exhaustion, fear, or both, he couldn't tell. The seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. Thomas didn't move, didn't speak again, just waited with infinite patience. He understood that this moment was crucial, that any wrong move could send her fleeing back into the prairie where she would almost certainly die. The sun beat down on both of them, relentless and uncaring. Finally, desperation won. She crawled forward on trembling hands and knees, her movements weak and uncoordinated. She grabbed the bucket with both hands, lifting it to her lips with visible effort. She drank in great gulping swallows, water spilling down her chin and chest, but she didn't slow until the bucket was half empty. Then she stopped, gasping for air, coughing and sputtering, her whole body shaking with the effort. She set the bucket down and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, her eyes never leaving Thomas's face. Thomas waited, giving her space and time to recover. He slowly reached for the bucket, moving deliberately so she could see exactly what he was doing. He lifted it and took a small sip himself, showing her that the water was safe, that he meant her no harm. Then he pushed it back toward her. "More," he said gently. "Drink more. Slowly this time." She hesitated, then reached for the bucket again. This time she drank more carefully, taking smaller sips, letting her body adjust to the sudden influx of moisture. Color began to return to her face, and her breathing became less labored. When she finished, she set the bucket down and looked at Thomas with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and lingering wariness. The afternoon sun beat down on both of them, but Thomas didn't move. This moment felt fragile, like a wild bird that might startle and flee at any sudden movement. He knew that building trust would take time, that he couldn't rush it no matter how much he wanted to get her out of the sun and into shelter. When she finally lifted her head again and met his gaze directly, he saw in her eyes a child who had been through something terrible, who had every reason to distrust him, but who was also desperate enough to accept help. "Come," Thomas said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. He gestured toward his cabin in the distance. "You can rest. Get out of the sun. Food. Water. Safe." She followed his gesture, looking at the cabin, then back at him. Her expression was unreadable, clearly torn between her need for safety and her ingrained caution around strangers, especially white settlers. Stories of violence and betrayal had surely been passed down through her people, warnings about trusting those who looked like Thomas. He couldn't blame her for her hesitation. Thomas stood slowly, picking up the bucket but making no move toward her. He began walking back toward his cabin, his pace deliberately slow and measured. He glanced over his shoulder to see if she would follow, not wanting to pressure her but hoping she would make the choice to trust him. After a long moment, she did. Her steps were unsteady, and she stumbled several times, catching herself with visible effort. She kept a careful distance behind him, ready to bolt if needed. Thomas matched his pace to hers, moving slowly enough that she wouldn't feel rushed or threatened, stopping when she stopped to rest, resuming when she seemed ready to continue. The walk back to the cabin felt like it took an eternity, each step weighted with the significance of the trust being tentatively built between them. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when they finally reached the cabin. Thomas pushed open the door, which creaked on its leather hinges, and stepped aside, allowing her to enter first if she chose. He knew that going first might make her feel trapped, that she needed to know she could leave at any moment. The girl paused at the threshold, peering into the dim interior. Her eyes needed a moment to adjust from the bright sunlight to the relative darkness inside. The cabin was sparse but clean, a single room that contained everything Thomas owned. A narrow bed stood in one corner, covered with a worn quilt his mother had made. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs occupied the center of the space. A stone fireplace took up most of one wall, with shelves on either side holding basic supplies, tin plates and cups, a few tools, some dried food in jars. A trunk at the foot of the bed contained his extra clothes and a few precious belongings from his former life. The floor was hard-packed dirt, swept clean. It wasn't much, but it was home, and it was more shelter than this child had right now. After a moment's consideration, she stepped inside, immediately moving to the farthest corner as if to keep the maximum distance between herself and the door. She pressed her back against the wall, her eyes tracking Thomas's every movement. He could see her body tensing, ready to run if he made any threatening gesture. Thomas moved slowly and deliberately to the water pitcher on his shelf, a clay vessel he had traded for at the last supply trip to the nearest settlement. He poured fresh water into a tin cup and set it on the table, then stepped back several paces, giving her space. The girl watched him carefully, her breathing still slightly labored, before approaching the table with cautious steps. She picked up the cup and examined it briefly before taking a drink. This time she drank more slowly, her hands still trembling slightly but with more control than before. When she finished, she set the cup down carefully and wrapped her arms around herself, despite the heat that filled the cabin. "You're safe here," Thomas said quietly, his voice gentle. "I promise. No one will hurt you." He knew she likely couldn't understand his words, but he hoped his tone would convey his meaning. He pulled a blanket from his bed, one of the few he owned, and offered it to her. She looked at it suspiciously at first, as if it might be a trick, then reached out and took it with hesitant fingers. She clutched it against her chest like a shield, something solid to hold onto in this strange situation. Thomas busied himself at the fireplace, building a small fire despite the heat. He wanted to heat some water for washing and to prepare a proper meal. The familiar tasks helped him think, gave him something to do with his hands while he processed the situation he now found himself in. He could feel her eyes on him, tracking his every movement with the wariness of someone who had learned that danger could come at any moment. As he worked, arranging kindling and striking flint to spark a flame, his mind raced with questions. How had she ended up alone, wandering the prairie? Where was her family, her tribe? The Comanche ranged across these territories in large bands, protecting their people and their lands. They rarely allowed their children to wander unprotected. Something must have gone terribly wrong. Had there been a raid by soldiers or rival tribes? Had she been separated from her people during a hunt or a move to new camping grounds? Had her family been killed, leaving her orphaned and alone? The possibilities troubled him deeply. Whatever had happened, it had been traumatic enough to send a child wandering alone into hostile territory, risking death from exposure, starvation, or worse. The fact that she had survived this long spoke to her strength and resilience, but she had been at the very edge of what was survivable when he found her. The light outside began to shift toward evening, the harsh white of midday softening to gold and amber. The angle of the sun's rays changed, casting long shadows across the prairie. Thomas prepared a meal of cornbread and beans, simple fare but filling and nutritious. He had made this meal countless times, could do it almost without thinking. He mixed cornmeal with water and a bit of precious salt, formed it into cakes, and set them to bake in his iron skillet. The beans had been soaking since morning and cooked quickly over the fire, softening and releasing their earthy aroma. When the food was ready, he placed a plate on the table with a generous portion and gestured for the girl to eat. She approached cautiously, drawn by the smell despite her fear. She sniffed the food carefully before taking a small bite of cornbread. Her eyes widened slightly, whether from surprise at the taste or simply from hunger, he couldn't tell. Then hunger won over caution, and she began to eat more quickly, though she kept glancing toward the door as if expecting danger to burst through at any moment. Thomas prepared his own plate but deliberately chose to eat sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, giving her the table and the chair, giving her the position of power in the room. He wanted her to feel as safe as possible, to understand that he wasn't going to trap her or assert dominance over her. The cabin settled into a peaceful quiet, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the occasional sound of their eating. Outside, the prairie began its evening chorus, insects chirping and night birds calling, the familiar sounds of the frontier at dusk. When the girl finished eating, she carefully set her plate down and returned to her corner, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders despite the lingering heat. The temperature inside the cabin was still warm from the day's heat and the fire, but Thomas understood that shock and trauma could make a person cold even in summer. She needed the comfort of the blanket more than the physical warmth it provided. Thomas cleaned the dishes and plates in a bucket of water, his movements slow and deliberate. He knew she was watching him, analyzing him, trying to determine if she had made the right choice in accepting his help. When he finished, he moved to the doorway, leaning against the frame and looking out at the darkening sky. He wanted to give her space, to not hover over her or make her feel trapped. "I'm Thomas," he said without turning around, keeping his voice soft. "Thomas Brennan. This is my home. My farm." There was a long silence. He didn't expect a response, but he wanted her to know his name, to have something to call him if she needed to. Names were important, they made people human to each other, created connection. When no answer came, he simply nodded to himself and continued his vigil at the door. The stars began to emerge, pinpricks of light in the deepening blue of twilight. The temperature dropped slightly, bringing blessed relief from the day's heat. A breeze stirred the prairie grass, carrying the scent of sage and earth. A coyote howled somewhere in the distance, its lonely cry echoing across the plains, and was answered by another farther away. Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. This child had stumbled into his life, needing help desperately, and he couldn't turn her away. But what came next? Would her people come looking for her? Would they believe that he had helped her, or would they see only a white settler who had taken one of their own? The questions gnawed at him, spinning through his mind in endless circles. There were no easy answers, no guidebook for this situation. All he could do was ensure her safety for now and face whatever consequences came tomorrow. He had made his choice the moment he ran toward her with that bucket of water, and he wouldn't second-guess it now. His father had taught him that a man's character was defined not by his words but by his actions, especially when no one was watching, when there was no reward to be gained. As full darkness fell, Thomas closed the door and secured it with a simple wooden latch. He added more wood to the fire, enough to keep the cabin warm through the night and to provide light. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating a play of light and dark that was both comforting and eerie. The girl had curled up in her corner, the blanket pulled tight around her small form, her eyes finally beginning to close with exhaustion. Thomas settled onto the floor near the fireplace, far enough from the girl to give her space but close enough to the door that he could respond if anyone tried to enter. He had his rifle within arm's reach, propped against the wall beside him. It was loaded and ready, not because he expected trouble, but because the frontier demanded constant vigilance. A man who wasn't prepared could find himself dead before he realized danger had arrived. Sleep would be difficult tonight, his mind too active with worry and possibility. He thought about his own childhood, growing up on a farm in Missouri. Life had been hard but good, filled with the simple rhythms of planting and harvest, of family meals and Sunday church services. His father had been a good man, stern but fair, who believed in honest work and treating others with respect. "Doesn't matter who they are or where they come from," his father had said more than once, usually while helping a neighbor or a stranger. "You see someone in need, you help. That's what makes us human instead of just animals fighting over territory. Those words had stayed with Thomas through the years, guiding his actions even when fear or prejudice might have pushed him in another direction. Tonight was no different. This child needed help, and he had provided it. Whatever came next would come, but at least he could face it knowing he had done the right thing, that he had lived up to the values his father had instilled in him. The fire crackled and popped, sending occasional sparks up the chimney. The wood was dry and burned clean, filling the cabin with warmth and the familiar smell of smoke. Thomas watched the play of light and shadow across the walls, his thoughts drifting between past and present. The girl's breathing had evened out, falling into the rhythm of sleep. She was safe, at least for now, sheltered from the harsh world outside these rough walls. Hours passed in quiet contemplation. Thomas dozed fitfully, his body exhausted from the day's work but his mind refusing to fully rest. He jerked awake at every small sound, the settling of the cabin timbers, the pop of the fire, the scurry of a mouse somewhere in the walls. Each time his hand would move instinctively toward his rifle before he realized there was no danger. He rose several times through the night to add wood to the fire, to check the latch on the door, to peer through the cracks between the logs at the dark prairie beyond. The moon rose slowly, climbing through the stars until it hung high overhead, bathing the landscape in silver light. The world outside looked peaceful, almost beautiful in the moonlight, giving no hint of the dangers that lurked in the darkness. Around midnight, the girl stirred, whimpering softly in her sleep. Thomas remained still, not wanting to startle her awake, but ready to offer comfort if she woke in distress. She muttered something in her own language, words he couldn't understand but which sounded distressed. Her small hands clutched the blanket tighter, and her face contorted with whatever nightmare she was experiencing. After a moment, she settled again, her breathing evening out, and the cabin returned to quiet. Thomas felt a surge of protectiveness toward this small stranger. Whatever she had been through, it had left scars that would take time to heal. He found himself hoping that she would find her way back to her people, that they would welcome her and help her overcome the trauma of her ordeal. But he also wondered if he would ever know what happened to her after she left his cabin, whether she would remember the white farmer who had helped her, or if she would simply fold this experience into the larger tapestry of her life and move on. The moon rose high, bathing the prairie in silver light that turned familiar landmarks strange and otherworldly. Thomas finally allowed himself to relax slightly, leaning back against the wall and letting his eyes close for more than a few moments at a time. True rest remained elusive, but he managed a kind of half-sleep where he remained aware of his surroundings while his body recovered some of its strength. He thought about the morning, about what daylight might bring. Would the girl's people come searching for her? Would they be hostile or understanding? There was no way to know, and the uncertainty gnawed at him like a persistent ache. The Comanche were fierce warriors, proud and protective of their people and their land. If they believed he had harmed the child or taken her captive, they would show no mercy. But if they understood that he had helped her, that he had saved her life, perhaps they would see him differently than they saw most white settlers. But beneath the worry, there was also a sense of rightness, a conviction that he had acted according to his deepest values. In a land where violence and suspicion often ruled, where fear drove people to commit terrible acts, he had chosen compassion. That choice might cost him dearly, might even cost him his life, but he found he could accept that. Some things were worth the risk. Some choices defined who you were as a person, and this was one of those choices. The first pale hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, gray bleeding slowly into the black of night. The stars began to fade, overwhelmed by the approaching day. Thomas stood and stretched his stiff muscles, wincing at the ache in his back from sleeping on the floor. His body wasn't as young as it used to be, and nights like this reminded him of that fact. He moved quietly to the water pitcher, took a long drink to clear the dryness from his throat, then splashed water on his face to wash away the grit and fatigue. The girl still slept, her small form barely visible in the heap of blankets. Thomas decided to let her rest as long as possible. She needed sleep to recover from her ordeal, and there was no reason to wake her before necessary. He eased open the door, stepping out into the cool morning air to survey his farm and check on his animals. The sky was clear, promising another hot, dry day. The air had that particular quality of early morning, fresh and clean before the heat and dust of the day settled in. He walked toward his small barn, a simple lean-to structure that housed his mule and a few chickens. The birds were already stirring, clucking softly and moving about their coop. The mule, a stubborn but reliable animal named Moses, snorted a greeting as Thomas approached. He would need to feed them, to let the chickens out to forage, to draw water for Moses. The familiar routines of farm life beckoned, grounding him in the physical world of daily tasks. But as he rounded the corner of the cabin, he froze in his tracks. His blood turned to ice, and his breath caught in his throat. The bucket he had been carrying fell from his nerveless fingers, hitting the ground with a dull thud. The entire perimeter of his farm was lined with mounted warriors. Dozens of them, perhaps 50 or more, sitting perfectly still on their horses like statues carved from bronze and iron. The rising sun caught the feathers in their hair, making them glow like small flames. The metal points of their lances gleamed wickedly, and the morning light reflected off the painted designs on their shields. They were Comanche, and they were watching him with an intensity that felt like physical pressure. Thomas's heart hammered in his chest so hard he thought it might burst through his ribs. Fear flooded his system, but he forced himself to remain calm, to keep his hands visible and relaxed at his sides. Any sudden movement, any sign of aggression or panic, could trigger violence that would end with his death. He had known this moment might come, had worried about it through the night, but facing the reality of it was far more terrifying than any imagining could have been. He stood perfectly still, his mind racing through his limited options. Running would be futile and fatal. Fighting would be suicide. His only hope was to show them that he meant no harm, that he had helped the girl, not hurt her. But how could he communicate that across the vast gulf of language and culture that separated them? How could he make them understand before they decided to kill him? Behind him, he heard the cabin door open with its familiar creak. Small footsteps padded across the packed earth. The girl emerged from the cabin, rubbing sleep from her eyes with one small fist. When she saw the warriors arrayed before her, her expression changed immediately from sleepy confusion to recognition and joy. She let out a cry, a word in her own language that sounded like a name or an exclamation, and ran past Thomas toward the assembled riders. One of the warriors, clearly a man of great importance, dismounted with fluid grace and strode forward. He was tall and lean, his body showing the hardness of a life lived in constant motion and challenge. His face was marked with the scars of battle, testament to his courage and skill as a warrior. His bearing radiated authority and strength, the confidence of a man who had led others through countless dangers. The girl ran to him, and he caught her up in his arms, holding her tightly against his chest while his eyes never left Thomas. Thomas remained where he was, hands still at his sides, meeting the chief's gaze with as much respect and steadiness as he could muster. His mouth was dry, his palms sweaty despite the cool morning air. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility and danger. The chief could order his warriors to attack. Thomas could die here, in front of his own cabin that he had built with his own hands, his life snuffed out for the simple act of showing kindness to a lost child. But the chief didn't give that order. Instead, he set the girl down gently but kept one hand on her shoulder as he listened intently to her rapid speech. She spoke quickly in her own language, her hands moving expressively as she gestured toward Thomas, toward the cabin, pantomiming drinking water and eating food. She pointed to the blanket she still clutched, to the cabin door, acting out her story with the natural expressiveness of a child explaining something important. The chief's expression remained stern and unreadable, but something shifted in his eyes, a subtle change that Thomas couldn't quite interpret. It might have been understanding, or it might have been calculation. Thomas had no way to know, could only stand there and hope that the girl's words were having the effect he desperately needed them to have. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a minute or two, the girl finished speaking. She looked up at the chief with an expression of earnest sincerity, clearly vouching for Thomas, telling the truth of what had happened. The chief studied her face for a long moment, reading something there that only he could see, then slowly returned his gaze to Thomas. The weight of that gaze was immense. Thomas felt as if he were being examined down to his very soul, every pretense and defense stripped away, leaving only the truth of who he was. The chief was judging him, weighing his worth, deciding whether he deserved to live or die. All Thomas could do was stand there and let himself be seen, hoping that what the chief saw would be enough. Then the chief did something unexpected. He walked slowly toward Thomas, each step deliberate and measured. Every warrior's eyes tracked his movement, hands ready on weapons, prepared to strike if their leader gave the signal. Thomas fought the urge to step back, to flee to the imagined safety of his cabin. Instead, he stood his ground, willing his body to remain relaxed and non-threatening even as every instinct screamed at him to run. The chief stopped a few paces away, close enough that Thomas could see the details of his face, the lines around his eyes, the set of his jaw, the intelligence and strength in his expression. They studied each other in silence, two men from vastly different worlds, meeting in a moment that could end in violence or understanding. Then the chief placed his right hand over his heart and inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement. The movement was small but profound, carrying weight and meaning that transcended language. Thomas, understanding instinctively the significance of what had just happened, returned the gesture. He placed his own hand over his heart and bowed his head, showing the same respect that had been offered to him. The tension that had gripped the morning began to ease, imperceptibly at first like ice beginning to melt, then more noticeably as the chief raised his hand and made a signal to his warriors. They lowered their weapons, their postures shifting from aggressive readiness to something more neutral. Some dismounted, moving to tend to their horses with practiced efficiency. The perimeter they had formed remained, but it no longer felt quite so threatening, more like a presence than an assault. The girl ran back to Thomas, chattering excitedly in her language and pointing at the cabin. She seemed to be continuing her story, telling the chief about the water, the food, the blanket, the safety she had found. Her complete lack of fear around Thomas now was perhaps the most powerful testimony to his character. Children knew, on some instinctive level, who could be trusted and who should be feared. Thomas gestured toward the well, toward the water bucket that still lay where he had dropped it. The chief understood the offer and nodded once, a slight movement of his head. Thomas walked slowly to the well, very aware of the eyes tracking his every movement, and drew up a bucket of fresh, cool water. His hands shook slightly as he worked the rope, but he managed to fill the bucket without spilling too much. He offered the dipper to the chief first, a sign of respect and recognition of his status. The chief accepted it without hesitation, drank deeply, then passed it to the girl. She drank again, though she had drunk her fill the night before, perhaps simply participating in the ritual of shared water. Then the dipper was passed among the nearest warriors, each drinking in turn, the simple act becoming a ceremony of sorts. The morning sun climbed higher, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. The light was clear and clean, illuminating everything with sharp detail. What had begun as a moment of potential violence had transformed into something else entirely, a strange peace built on mutual recognition of humanity and honor. Thomas felt the knot of fear in his chest begin to loosen, replaced by a cautious optimism and a growing sense of wonder at what was happening. The chief spoke, his voice deep and carrying natural authority. The words were incomprehensible to Thomas, but the tone conveyed respect and perhaps gratitude. He responded in English, knowing the chief likely wouldn't understand the words but hoping his tone would communicate the same respect and good intentions. "She was thirsty and lost," Thomas said simply, his voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through his system. "I gave her water and shelter. That's all. I meant no harm. I only wanted to help her." The chief seemed to understand the essence, if not the specific words. He placed his hand on the girl's head affectionately, a gesture of love and protection, then looked at Thomas again with what might have been approval. Another exchange of words in the Comanche language, rapid and fluid, then the chief made a gesture that Thomas interpreted as a request for more water. Thomas hurried to comply, grateful for something concrete to do. He drew bucket after bucket from the well, his arms burning with the effort but not caring. He offered water to all the warriors who wanted it, and many did. They had been riding perhaps all night, searching for the lost child, and they were thirsty and tired. They accepted the water with various degrees of acknowledgement, some nodding their thanks, others remaining stoic and watchful, but all drinking deeply. The girl helped, her earlier fear completely evaporated now that her people were here. She carried smaller containers, a tin cup and a bowl, moving between the warriors and chattering happily. Her resilience amazed Thomas. Just yesterday she had been at death's door, and now she was bright and energetic, as if the trauma had burned away in the presence of her people's safety. As the warriors drank and rested their horses, Thomas found himself in the surreal position of playing host to a Comanche war party. He went into his cabin and brought out what food he could spare without leaving himself destitute. Cornbread from last night, some dried meat he had been saving, even a precious jar of preserves his sister had sent from Missouri. He offered it all freely, placing it on a blanket spread on the ground. The chief accepted a portion with a nod of acknowledgement, and the gesture was noted by all present. The fact that their leader had accepted food from this white settler meant something, established a connection that went beyond mere tolerance. Some of the other warriors also took food, eating quickly but with evident appreciation. The morning wore on in this strange détente. Thomas showed no fear, though anxiety still churned in his gut. The warriors showed no aggression, though they remained alert and watchful. The girl moved freely between the groups, a small ambassador of the peace that had formed between these unlikely parties. Thomas caught the chief watching him several times, and each time he met the gaze openly, with nothing to hide, hoping that his sincerity was visible in his expression and bearing. Around mid-morning, when the sun had climbed high enough to begin heating the air toward uncomfortable levels, the chief gathered his warriors with a series of hand signals. They prepared to leave, mounting their horses with the practiced ease of people who had spent their entire lives on horseback. The girl received a pony, helped up by one of the warriors who checked to make sure she was seated securely. Before mounting his own horse, the chief approached Thomas one final time. He reached into a leather pouch at his side and withdrew a small object, holding it out on his palm. Thomas stepped closer to see what was being offered. It was a carved stone pendant, beautifully crafted in the shape of a bird in flight, hanging on a leather cord. The detail in the carving was extraordinary, each feather visible, the posture of the bird capturing the essence of freedom and grace. Thomas accepted it with reverence, understanding that this was a gift of great significance. He held it carefully, running his thumb over the smooth stone, feeling the hours of work that had gone into its creation. He wanted to offer something in return, some token of equal value, but he had nothing that seemed worthy. His possessions were simple and utilitarian, nothing beautiful or meaningful enough to match this gift. Then he remembered. He reached up and untied the neckerchief from around his neck, a simple piece of cloth but one his mother had given him before he left Missouri 5 years ago. It was worn soft from use and washing, faded from its original bright blue to a gentle gray blue. But it was one of his few connections to his family, to his past, to the life he had left behind. He offered it to the chief with both hands, bowing his head slightly as he did so. The chief took the neckerchief, examining it carefully, running the soft fabric between his fingers. He seemed to understand the significance of what was being offered, that this was not just a piece of cloth but something personal, something valued. He nodded solemnly and tucked the neckerchief into his belt, then placed his hand briefly on Thomas's shoulder, a gesture of respect between equals. The chief mounted his horse with fluid grace, settling into position with the ease of a man who had spent more time on horseback than on foot. He raised his hand in farewell, a gesture that was both dismissal and acknowledgement. Then he wheeled his horse toward the open prairie, and the warriors followed in formation. The girl waved frantically from her pony, calling out something in her language that Thomas didn't understand but that sounded like gratitude or goodbye. He waved back, his throat tight with emotion he couldn't quite name. Thomas stood alone in his yard, the pendant clutched in his hand, watching them go. They moved across the prairie like a living thing, flowing over the land with a grace and unity that spoke of generations of tradition and skill. The dust from their horses' hooves rose in a cloud that caught the morning light, turning golden in the sun. He watched until they disappeared completely, swallowed by the vast expanse of grass and sky, until even the dust had settled and there was nothing left to see. The prairie returned to its customary emptiness, but Thomas felt fundamentally changed. He had faced death and found life instead. He had extended kindness and received honor in return. The encounter would stay with him forever, a moment when the divisions and violence of the frontier gave way to something better, something more human. He looked down at the pendant in his hand, turning it over to see the details of the carving. The bird seemed almost alive, captured in a moment of perfect freedom. He went inside his cabin and found a nail, drove it into the wall above his bed, and hung the pendant there where he would see it every morning when he woke and every night before he slept. It would serve as a reminder of this day, of the choice he had made and the unexpected reward it had brought. The Wild West was harsh and unforgiving, but it could also be the setting for moments of grace, for connections that transcended the hatred and fear that so often defined relations between peoples. Thomas returned to his work, the corn that still needed tending, the endless tasks of farm life that waited for no man. But he worked with a lighter heart, the loneliness that had weighed on him before feeling less oppressive. The encounter had shown him that he was not as alone as he had thought, that there were others in this vast territory, and that peaceful coexistence was possible if both sides chose it. The pendant swayed gently above his bed that night as he lay down to sleep, catching the firelight and throwing small shadows on the wall. Thomas touched it once before closing his eyes, remembering the girl's smile, the chief's hand on his shoulder, the moment of understanding that had passed between them. Sleep came easier than it had in weeks. Days passed, then weeks. The summer continued its relentless march toward autumn, each day bringing the same fierce heat and cloudless skies. Thomas fell back into his routines, the rhythm of planting and harvesting, of maintaining his small homestead against the challenges of weather and isolation. He worked his fields, tended his animals, repaired what needed repairing. But the memory of that dawn remained vivid, a bright point in the monotony of solitary frontier life. He found himself thinking about the girl often, wondering if she was safe, if she had truly recovered from her ordeal. He imagined her back with her people, playing with other children, learning the skills and stories of her culture. He hoped that the trauma of being lost had faded, replaced by the security of being found and welcomed home. He wondered if she told the story of the white farmer who had given her water, who had sheltered her without asking for anything in return. The pendant hung above his bed, a constant presence. Sometimes, when the loneliness grew too heavy, when the isolation of frontier life pressed down on him like a physical weight, Thomas would touch it, remembering that he was not entirely alone in this harsh land. He had made a connection, however brief, and that connection had meant something profound. Summer deepened, the heat becoming even more intense. The drought continued unabated, and Thomas's crops struggled desperately against the harsh conditions. He worked harder than ever, carrying water from the well to his plants, trying to keep them alive through sheer force of will. But he knew the harvest would be lean this year, that he would have to be careful with his supplies through the coming winter. But he worked on, determined to coax what life he could from the reluctant soil. This was the bargain he had made when he claimed this land, the challenge he had accepted. The frontier demanded everything from those who chose to make it their home, and Thomas was willing to pay that price. In the evenings, he would sit outside his cabin, watching the sun set over the prairie. The sky would turn brilliant shades of orange and red and purple, a display of natural beauty that never failed to move him. The long twilight that followed was his favorite time of day, when the heat finally began to break and the world seemed to hold its breath between day and night. He would sit and watch the stars emerge one by one, thinking about his life, about the choices that had brought him here, about the unexpected turns that had changed everything. One evening, about a month after the encounter, Thomas saw riders approaching in the distance. His heart quickened, and his hand moved instinctively toward his rifle where it leaned against the cabin wall. But as they drew closer, he recognized the familiar silhouettes of Comanche warriors. He set the rifle aside and walked out to meet them, his pulse racing but his mind calm. It was a smaller group this time, only 5 or 6 warriors, and they were led by a younger man Thomas didn't recognize from the previous visit. The leader was perhaps in his mid-20s, lean and strong, with an air of confidence that came from proven skill. They stopped at the edge of his property, and the leader called out a greeting in his own language, raising his hand in the gesture Thomas now recognized as peaceful acknowledgement. Thomas raised his hand in return, approaching cautiously but without fear. The warriors had brought gifts, he realized with growing amazement. They carried bundles wrapped in hide, and as they dismounted and approached, they began laying them out before him. Dried meat, beautifully tanned hides that would be invaluable for the coming winter, and even a small pouch of seeds for plants Thomas had never seen before but which might grow better in this harsh climate than his struggling corn. The leader offered them to Thomas with gestures that made their purpose clear. This was payment, or perhaps thanks, for his kindness to the child. Thomas accepted the gifts with deep gratitude, overwhelmed by the generosity. He had not expected any reward for his actions, had not helped the girl with any thought of compensation. But here it was, offered freely, a recognition of his deed. He wished he had more to offer in return, but he brought out what he could. Fresh water drawn from the well, bread he had baked that morning, some vegetables from his small garden that had somehow survived the drought. The warriors accepted graciously, settling themselves in the dusty yard as the sun set around them. They shared a simple meal together, sitting in a rough circle, passing food back and forth. They couldn't speak each other's languages, but they communicated through gestures and expressions, through the shared act of breaking bread together. Thomas learned a few words of Comanche, the names of common objects and simple greetings. The warriors learned a few English words in return, laughing at each other's pronunciation, the sound warm and friendly in the evening air. It was a beginning, a tentative bridge being built across the chasm of culture and history that separated them. As darkness fell and the stars emerged in their familiar patterns, the warriors prepared to leave. They had come a long way, and they had other places to be, other responsibilities calling them back to their people. The leader clasped Thomas's forearm in a warrior's grip, holding it firmly for a moment before releasing it and mounting his horse. The gesture spoke of respect, of recognition, of a bond being acknowledged between them. Thomas watched them ride away into the night, their silhouettes gradually disappearing into the darkness. He stood there for a long time after they were gone, looking up at the stars, thinking about the strangeness and beauty of what was happening. He had come to the frontier expecting isolation and hardship, and he had found those things. But he had also found something unexpected, a connection with people he had been taught to fear, a relationship built on mutual respect and basic human decency. The visits became occasional but regular after that. Every few weeks, a small group of Comanche would appear at the edge of his farm, always bringing gifts, always departing peacefully. Thomas came to anticipate these visits with genuine pleasure, preparing for them by setting aside portions of his harvest or making extra bread. He looked forward to the companionship, brief though it was, the chance to see friendly faces and share simple moments of human connection. The exchanges were never spoken of as trade, but both sides understood the value of the relationship being built. Thomas received meat and hides that helped him survive the harsh frontier winters. The Comanche received access to water from his well, which never ran dry even in the worst droughts, and sometimes bread or vegetables or other foods they couldn't easily obtain. But more than the material goods, both sides received something more valuable, the knowledge that peaceful coexistence was possible, that the violence and fear that characterized so much of frontier life was not inevitable. Through these visits, Thomas learned more about his neighbors, their customs and values, their deep connection to the land. He began to see the prairie through their eyes, not as empty wilderness to be tamed and conquered but as a living entity to be respected and understood. His perspective shifted, broadened, became more nuanced than the simple settler's view he had brought with him from Missouri. He learned to read the signs of the weather in ways he never had before, to find water where he would have thought there was none, to understand the movements of animals and the patterns of the seasons. The warriors, for their part, seemed to appreciate Thomas's respect for their ways. He never tried to change them or convert them, never looked down on their culture or their choices. He simply accepted them as they were, showed them hospitality when they visited, and went about his own life the rest of the time. This acceptance, this willingness to coexist without trying to dominate or control, was rare among white settlers, and it was noted and valued. The girl visited once more that summer, in late August when the heat was finally beginning to break and the first hints of autumn could be felt in the morning air. She rode proudly on her own pony, a beautiful paint with a flowing mane. She had grown taller, Thomas noticed, and she seemed more confident, more settled in herself. The trauma of being lost had not disappeared, he suspected, but it had been integrated into her experience, become part of her story rather than the defining element of her existence. She laughed when she saw Thomas, a sound of pure joy that rang across the prairie. She called out a greeting in her language, words he now recognized as friendly acknowledgement. He waved back, grinning broadly, delighted to see her thriving. Her escorts were clearly protective and watchful, keeping careful track of her movements, but they allowed her to approach Thomas and speak with him. She gave him a gift she had made herself, a woven bracelet in bright colors, red and yellow and blue. The weaving was intricate and beautiful, clearly the work of many hours. Thomas accepted it with solemn ceremony, understanding the significance of a gift made by hand, the time and thought that had gone into its creation. He placed it immediately on his wrist, adjusting it carefully so it fit securely. She beamed at him, her dark eyes sparkling with joy and pride. They stood together for a moment, the white farmer and the Comanche child, connected by a shared experience that had changed both of their lives. Thomas wanted to say something meaningful, to tell her how much that encounter had meant to him, how it had altered his understanding of the world and his place in it. But he had no words that would bridge the language gap, no way to express the complexity of what he felt. So instead he simply placed his hand over his heart and bowed his head, the gesture he had learned from her people, the one that spoke of respect and honor. She returned it, her small hand pressed against her chest, her head inclined with surprising dignity for one so young. Then she turned and was lifted back onto her pony by one of her escorts, and they rode away, her laughter floating back to him on the wind. Thomas watched them until they disappeared, his hand touching the bracelet on his wrist. It would stay there, he decided, worn until it fell apart from age and use. Like the pendant above his bed, it would serve as a reminder of what had happened, of the choice he had made and the connections it had forged. As autumn approached and the intense heat finally began to break, Thomas reflected on the extraordinary turn his life had taken. He had come to the Oklahoma Territory seeking solitude and the satisfaction of working the land with his own hands. He had found those things, but he had also found something unexpected, a connection across cultural divides, a friendship built on mutual respect and basic human decency. The harvest was indeed lean that year, the drought having taken a severe toll on his crops. Much of the corn had withered despite his best efforts, and the vegetables had produced far less than he had hoped. But Thomas didn't go hungry, thanks to the gifts of dried meat and the knowledge of edible prairie plants that his Comanche neighbors had shared through gesture and example. He learned which roots could be dug up and eaten, which plants produced nutritious seeds, which berries were safe and which were poisonous. He survived the winter, modest but sufficient, his cabin stocked with enough food and fuel to see him through the cold months. The pendant swayed above his bed through the long winter nights, and the bracelet remained on his wrist, reminders of connection in the midst of isolation. When spring came and the prairie began to green again, Thomas planted his fields with renewed hope, using some of the seeds the Comanche had given him alongside his traditional crops. The visits continued through the following years, less frequent as time went on but never ceasing entirely. The relationship that had been forged that summer day remained strong, a bond of trust and respect that survived despite the increasing tensions between settlers and native peoples throughout the territory. Thomas became a known figure to the local Comanche bands, a white settler who could be trusted, who had proven his character in a moment of crisis and had maintained that character ever since. When other settlers arrived in the area, drawn by reports of good land and opportunity, some heard stories of the farmer who was friend to the Comanche. They sought his advice on how to coexist with the native peoples, how to avoid the conflicts that so often turned violent and destructive. Thomas shared what he had learned, emphasizing respect and basic humanity, the simple principles that had guided his actions that summer day when he found a lost child wandering through his fields. "Treat them like people," he would say, his voice carrying the conviction of experience. "Show respect. Keep your word. Don't take what isn't yours. It's not complicated. They're just people trying to live their lives, same as us." Some settlers listened and benefited from his wisdom, building their own peaceful relationships with their Comanche neighbors. They learned that coexistence was possible, that the frontier didn't have to be a place of constant fear and violence. Others dismissed his advice, choosing conflict over cooperation, seeing the native peoples as obstacles to be removed rather than neighbors to be respected. Those settlers often suffered the consequences of their choices, finding themselves at odds with people who knew the land far better than they did and who had no patience for disrespect or broken promises. Thomas watched these dynamics play out with a heavy heart. He saw the patterns repeating, the same mistakes made over and over. More settlers arrived each year, pushing further into lands that had been Comanche territory for generations. The government made promises it didn't keep, drew boundaries it didn't respect. Tensions increased, and the peaceful coexistence Thomas had found became harder and harder to maintain. But even as the larger world changed, becoming more complicated and more violent, the bond forged that summer day remained. The Comanche who knew Thomas continued to visit when they could, continued to honor the relationship they had built. He became a kind of neutral ground, a place where warriors could water their horses and rest without fear, where disputes could sometimes be discussed and resolved without bloodshed. Years passed, and the frontier slowly changed around him. More settlers arrived, towns grew where there had been only empty prairie, and the open spaces began to shrink. The Comanche were pushed further west, their traditional lands claimed by newcomers who rarely bothered to seek peaceful coexistence. Thomas watched these changes with increasing sadness, seeing the fragile bridges he and others had built being burned by greed and ignorance. His farm prospered modestly. He never became wealthy, never expanded beyond his original claim, but he made a decent living from the land. His crops improved as he learned which plants grew best in the Oklahoma soil and climate, as he integrated the knowledge he had gained from his Comanche neighbors with his own farming traditions. He remained solitary, never marrying, never building the family he had once thought he might want. The frontier had become his life, and he found a kind of contentment in the rhythms of the seasons and the satisfaction of work done well. But he was never entirely alone. The visits continued, irregular but consistent, a thread of connection running through the years. He aged, his hair going gray, his body becoming stooped from decades of hard labor. The cabin he had built with his own hands weathered and aged alongside him, the logs darkening with time, the roof requiring occasional repair. The fields he had cleared remained productive, testament to years of careful stewardship. When Thomas was an old man, his hands gnarled and his back permanently bent from a lifetime of work, he still received occasional visits. The warriors who came now were sometimes the sons or even grandsons of those he had first met, the tradition of visiting the friendly white farmer passed down through generations. They still brought gifts, and he still offered hospitality, though his offerings were simpler now that he was old and his energy limited. One spring day, when the prairie was brilliant with wildflowers and the air was sweet with the scent of growing things, the girl came back. She was no longer a girl, of course, but a woman in her prime, perhaps 40 years old. She had children of her own now, Thomas could see, and she brought her eldest daughter with her, a girl about the same age she had been when Thomas first found her stumbling through his fields. They rode up to his cabin in the late afternoon, when the light was golden and the shadows were growing long. Thomas was sitting on his porch, as he often did these days, his old body grateful for rest after even modest work. He recognized her immediately despite the years, something in the way she moved, in the set of her features. His heart swelled with emotion as she dismounted and approached. They sat together on his porch, 3 generations spanning the gulf between cultures and histories. The woman told her daughter the story in their own language, gesturing toward Thomas, toward the fields, miming thirst and drinking. Her hands moved expressively as she spoke, painting a picture with gestures as well as words. The child listened with wide eyes, glancing at the ancient white farmer with curiosity and respect, trying to imagine him young and strong, running across the fields with a bucket of water. When the story was finished, Thomas felt compelled to speak, to add his own perspective. "You changed my life," he said, his voice rough with age and emotion. "Finding you, helping you, it showed me what was possible. What we could be to each other if we chose kindness instead of fear." The woman listened, understanding some of his words through the English she had learned over the years from traders and missionaries and other encounters with the changing world. She smiled, that same bright smile from her childhood, and spoke slowly in English, choosing her words with care. "Thank you," she said simply. "You saved me. I never forgot. My people never forgot." She reached into a pouch at her side and withdrew something wrapped in soft leather. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a new pendant, similar to the one the chief had given Thomas all those years ago but even more intricately carved. This one showed 2 birds in flight, side by side, neither leading nor following but flying together. "For remembering," she said, offering it to him. "For teaching us that not all white men are enemies. For being friend when you could have been enemy." Thomas accepted the pendant with trembling hands, tears rolling down his weathered cheeks. He had not cried in years, had thought himself too old and too hardened by frontier life for such displays of emotion. But this moment broke through all his defenses, touching something deep within him that he had thought long dormant. "I did what anyone should do," he managed to say. "What we all should do for each other." She nodded, understanding. "Yes. But not everyone does. You did. That matters." They sat together a while longer, watching the sun descend toward the horizon. The daughter asked questions in her own language, and her mother answered, pointing out features of the farm, explaining the significance of various things. Thomas sat quietly, content to be in their presence, grateful for this unexpected grace. Before they left, the woman touched his weathered hand, her fingers gentle against his age-spotted skin. "You will be remembered," she said softly. "In our stories. In our history. The white farmer who showed kindness. Who proved that peace was possible." Thomas watched them ride away into the evening, just as he had watched the warriors ride away so many years before. But this time he knew it would probably be the last time. He was old now, his body failing despite his will to continue. His time on the prairie was drawing to a close, though he didn't know exactly when the end would come. But he had lived a good life, he thought, settling back into his chair with the new pendant clutched in his hands. He had worked hard, survived against the odds, built something lasting from nothing but determination and sweat. And most importantly, he had acted with compassion when it mattered most. That summer day, decades ago, when he had run toward a desperate child with a bucket of water, had defined the man he became. Every choice afterward had been shaped by that moment, by the understanding that kindness could bridge any divide, that respect and basic human decency could overcome even the deepest prejudices and fears. The sun set over the Oklahoma prairie, painting the sky in magnificent shades of orange and red and purple. Thomas sat on his porch, both pendants now hanging around his neck, the old one worn smooth from years of handling and the new one sharp with fresh detail. The woven bracelet still circled his wrist, faded almost to colorlessness but still intact. He touched each item gently, remembering all that had come from that one choice, that one moment of seeing another human being in need and responding with simple kindness. The prairie had been his home for more than 40 years, his challenge and his teacher. It had shown him both its harshness and its capacity for beauty. It had brought him loneliness and connection, hardship and grace. It had tested him in ways he never could have anticipated when he first arrived as a young man with more dreams than sense, and he had passed those tests not through strength or cunning but through simple humanity. As darkness fell and the stars emerged in their eternal patterns, Thomas Brennan closed his eyes, content with the life he had lived and the man he had been. The Wild West had been everything the stories said it was, harsh and violent and unforgiving. But it had also been something more, something the stories often missed. It had been a place where choices mattered, where a single act of kindness could ripple outward through time, changing lives and building bridges. He had offered water to a thirsty child, and in return he had received a gift beyond measure, the knowledge that he had made a difference, that his life had touched others in meaningful ways, that in a time and place often defined by conflict and fear, he had chosen peace and compassion. And that choice, more than anything else he had done in his long life, had made him truly rich. The pendant swayed gently against his chest as he breathed, catching the starlight, and Thomas smiled. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. But tonight, he was at peace.